the most important and the most influential iteration of Marxist thinking was in the Russian Revolution. And it was the first major communist revolution, and it was the first one to be successful. Now, Russia was sort of an odd country in that respect. There had been, Russia had just liberated its serfs in 1861. So they had serfdom, people tied to the land, basically a peasant class that was in place until very recently. There were constant coups and attempts to overthrow the government and religious or revolutionary activities throughout their history. The Tsar was assassinated in 1879. That would have been Alexander II. Yeah, I think so. He was assassinated in 1879 on the verge of giving a speech declaring how he was going to democratize the country, etc. So Russia was a very traditional country. The rulers still justified themselves with divine right. After much of Europe had already transitioned, much of Western Europe, Russia was still that odd country that was primarily agricultural. It was primarily, it was a monarchical society, a true monarchy. There wasn't really a constitution to temper it, unlike in Britain or in Germany, etc., or Prussia at that time. Now, Russia was probably the poorest country in Europe, but also the most popular. And as we should know, Russia entered World War I in 1914 on the side of the Allied powers, or the Allied powers, the Triple Entente, that's it, and had suffered disastrous defeats. There weren't enough guns for people in the army. It's a famous story that the Russians would send one wave of troops with guns, and the wave behind them wouldn't have any. And the wave behind them was told, "Oh, pick up the guns of the people who were shot in the first wave." So it's pretty desperate times. Anyway, there was a great deal of disgust with the Russian monarchy at this time, and people wanted a change. The army was revolting against its leaders, and as I said, there were a great number. There was a revolutionary history in Russia. I mean, there was a great number of movements working toward revolution. This brings us to Lenin, who was the major figure of the Russian Revolution and probably the most important communist thinker after Marx. And so we're going to go into his life and his thinking. But Lenin was born in 1870. He was of the minor nobility, and interestingly, his brother was arrested for an attempt to murder Tsar Alexander III, and he was hanged. And Lenin sort of came up as a revolutionary too. And it's important to know he was a revolutionary before he was a Marxist. So this is very common at this time. Because all these sort of revolutionary groups, socialists, communists, anarchists, were all kind of grouped together. And it took many years and into the 20th century before their differences really started to push them apart. If we, I think I discussed in my last lecture a meeting of the First International in Britain, which was kind of a meeting of these socialist groups and communist groups, and there was a whole different bunch of them, and they were all sort of, competing with each other as to what was the correct way and the correct time to go. So Lenin was interested in overthrowing the government before he had any conception of who Marx was and what his thinking was. And he was educated as a lawyer at Kazan State University, and it sounds like Kansas State University. I thought that was interesting, but not really. Let's see. Okay, that didn't work. Here he is. In 1895, he was imprisoned and exiled for 14 months. And that's interesting to note because he was basically condemned for revolutionary activity. He was put in jail for a few months and then exiled for 14 months to a village to live in Siberia. And if you look at exactly what what if you were arrested and found guilty of political radicalism and political revolution under the communist system, you would usually be sentenced to 15 to 20 years in a labor camp, and or else killed. And so it's kind of interesting to know how lenient the Tsarist system was, where a very dangerous revolutionary like Lenin was just exiled for a little bit. He was involved in a movement called the 1905 Revolution, which took place in 1905, and it was an attempt to seize power. But it was crushed by Tsarist forces, and Lenin left. Now, Lenin, about the time before he was in exile, started to read Marx. And Marx's most famous book, we read the Communist Manifesto, but Marx's most important book, his most famous book, is called Das Kapital, and it's translated as Capital. And that was actually allowed in Russia. The Tsarist censors considered it high theory. It wasn't dangerous at all. It wasn't revolutionary activity. So they probably regretted that decision. He was living in Switzerland in 1917. And in 1917, the Tsar abdicated. The Russian army kept losing, and the Tsar was basically pushed out of office. He was in Switzerland, and the German government, he petitioned the German government to be able to cross Germany and enter Russia. And the Germans were like, well, yeah, we'll go all for it. This guy will go in there, he'll create political unrest, and he might be able to encourage a revolution and make peace with Germany, which he ultimately did. Russia made peace with Germany. They gave up a huge amount of land to the Germans in exchange for peace. Importantly, they also sent a whole bunch of grain, which contributed to a great number of famines early on. Now here's a nice propaganda cartoon. I only included a few pieces of Soviet propaganda. It's kind of fun to look at. But we see Lenin sweeping away, and we have the kings and emperors, and the wealthy, fat capitalists, and that's a priest, an Orthodox priest, a Catholic. So Lenin is cleansing the world of all this, these stupid ideas and the oppressors, etc. He was seen as this, great revolutionary who would bring about change, rid the world of oppression, etc. So, kind of the timeline of the Russian Revolution. February 1917, Nicholas abdicates, and a provisional government is formed. And this government consists of liberals, and Democrats, it's very conservatives, socialists, communists, anarchists. It consists of all these different groups. And so you can imagine it didn't run very well. It sort of tried to ride the line between revolution and stability. And at this time there was a civil war occurring in Russia too, the Reds versus the Whites it was called, and it was a very, very bloody and nasty affair in which former monarchist and Tsarist troops were fighting against the revolutionary groups called the Reds. Now, in 1917, Lenin returned to Russia and immediately just opposed this provisional government. He said, they're not going to do enough. They're not going to pursue the radical changes that we need in our society to effect, profound change. And that's a big, important point behind the Russian Revolution. It was all about change. It's what makes a revolution different from just a coup or a civil war or something like that. There is a profound transformation in who governs society, in how society is ordered, and how the economy is ordered, etc. So, almost all of these revolutionaries were of the left, but there were different groups of them. There were we talked about the Fabian socialists, or the evolutionary socialists who wanted sort of slow, gradual change, and the revolutionary socialists. And they split into these two camps called the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Now, Bolshevik is from the Russian word majority, and Menshevik is from minority, which is very misleading because the Bolsheviks were a very small, very radical group of people. But through their sort of cunning and their extremism, they were able to win. Throughout this time, the Civil War intensified. The Reds sort of won, but then there was another skirmish between these Bolshevik and Menshevik camps. In October 1917, there's what's called the October Revolution and Civil War, and men like Trotsky and Stalin really distinguished themselves. Stalin was originally came up as a hardcore revolutionary, a very radical communist. He knew Lenin in exile, and during the Civil War, he went in and to a city in Western Russia called Tsaritsyn, which was later renamed Stalingrad, and took an armored railway car and a bunch of cannons and won this supposedly great victory, which wasn't really that great, but he convinced a lot of people that it was, and he made himself very popular. Trotsky, Leon Trotsky, who we'll discuss in a minute, was put in charge of the army. And the Red Army, as it were, was mainly a group of people who had fought in World War I and didn't really have any allegiance. So what he would do is when he'd send men into battle, he'd put a machine gun nest behind them and tell them if they turned back, they'd all get shot. So very, very extreme actions from men like Trotsky and Stalin. And it took this very extreme, very harsh activity for them to win. So again, you have people so devoted to a cause that they're willing to be extremely violent and willing to do almost anything, any barbarity. They would, capture officers and hold their families hostage and say, if you don't lead our men into battle, we're going to kill all of them. And all this, horrible stuff. It shows how political thinking and political thought can really translate into very horrible consequences. Now, Leninism or Bolshevism, as we kind of know it, is an elaboration on Marxist thought, and it really attempts to fill that void of implementation. Remember, we talked about, with Marx, first you have this revolution, and then we have something called the dictatorship of the proletariat, and yada, 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 and boom, communism. There's not really much there. He doesn't really explain how it goes. He talks about confiscating private property and abolishing traditional marriage and things like that, but really there's no real sense of how this is accomplished. And what Lenin does, and what makes him such an important figure and thinker, is he comes up with sort of a program of how this can be accomplished. And he also comes up with a justification of why communism can work in Russia. Remember, Marx believed that communism would take foot in advanced industrialized capitalist countries. Like, he thought it would take hold in Germany. He thought it would take hold in Britain before it took hold in anywhere else. However, let's see. Lenin argued that in these advanced capitalist countries, and this is the third bullet point up here, that they engaged in imperialism, which is the highest point of capitalism. That they went out, and certainly this was true in the 19th century. Advanced capitalist countries would go out and procure an empire and get natural resources, and essentially, instead of exploiting their own proletariat, they would exploit foreigners and the poor of other countries. And so they were able to pacify their working class with a higher standard of living. So in advanced capitalist countries, this imperialism sort of staunched the trend of revolution that was going to happen. So Lenin believed that communism could only take place in less advanced countries like Russia, because their poor and oppressed were so horribly downtrodden that they wouldn't be, culled by a higher standard of living. Ideally, one would have thought that Marxism would have been thrown out the window in 1914, when the working men of France and Britain and Germany and Austria and Russia all went to war with each other. They threw up their class consciousness and said, hey, we don't care about that. We don't care about this workers' worldwide revolution. We're going to war. one would have thought that communism would have gone away at that point. But no, they justified it, or Lenin justified it this way. So imperialism is the highest form of capitalism. There was one of Lenin's most important contributions is this idea of a Vanguard Party of professional revolutionaries. And in communist society, there would be this core group of leaders that were basically professional revolutionaries. They would, campaign and educate people and work to expose extremists and centrists and monarchists and people on the right. And this is exactly what Lenin tried to cultivate. He surrounded himself with all these radicals like Stalin and Trotsky and Bukharin and so many people that were devoted to the cause. And it'd be this core group of people that would instigate the revolution. So you didn't have to rely on everyone in the country buying into communism and participating to achieve this effect. You could rely on a small group of people. And certainly the Soviet Union was reflected by this. There's also, and this is really important, especially coming later, there was a rejection of Russian nationalism. He saw nationalism as horrible. Communism is supposed to be a worldwide revolution, a worldwide movement, and people having nationalism or faith and pride in their country, patriotism, is just silly. I mean, it's antithetical to what communism wanted. Now we'll see later on that this is given up. So these are some of the tenets of Lenin's thought and why he's so important. Especially if you read kind of political theory today, and there are some Marxists out there, and especially in work on less developed countries and economic development, there are a lot of Marxists out there still writing who use this framework, that imperialism and capitalism fosters imperialism, which is why the United States and Western Europe are so wealthy, and they exploit the poorer countries of the world. So it's very, very important. And this framed how the Soviet Union sort of viewed foreign policy throughout the entire time. Now Lenin, as we said, came into power in roughly 1917. But by 1922, he was sort of out of it. And he was replaced by a group of these professional revolutionaries. Here we see Lenin and Stalin together, both in exile. I think that was taken in Paris, but I'm not sure. And when Lenin died in 1924, he left sort of two successors who were very different in their ideologies.